Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Southern Fire Exchange webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the coordinator for the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. And I'm excited to be joined today by a number of our other SFE team members scattered between Colorado, Florida, and NC State. We have Andy Oxenhart, Dr. Alan Long, and Dr. Joe Royce with us today. We're excited to have our guest speaker, Dr. Cecil Frost, landscape fire ecologist with NC State University. Cecil will be given a presentation discussing evidence and techniques for restoring pre-European colonization fire regimes.
That's fine.
We'd like to take a quick moment to share a bit of information about the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast, and we are a collaborative between the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, and NC State University. We're part of a very successful nationwide network of fire science exchanges that are hosted by the Joint Fire Science Program. And we exist to increase the availability and application of fire science information for natural resource managers, and to then serve as a conduit for fire managers to connect with and share their information needs with folks in the science and research community. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cecil Frost. Cecil is a landscape fire ecologist and research collaborator with the University of North Carolina. He has a Ph.D. in plant ecology from the University of North Carolina, and he's the former coordinator of the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, where he managed endangered plant species in North Carolina, including the purchase and restoration of lands acquired in those preserves. During 2004, Cecil was a member of the national team for the FRCC, which was the Fire Regime Condition Clash Project, which led to the creation of Landfire, the nationwide system of GIS maps and data, which includes historical vegetation, historical fire frequency, and modern deviations from natural fire regimes. He retired from the NC Plant Conservation Program back in 2004 to work full-time in fire ecology, and since then he's worked on making maps of original fire regimes and vegetation, and his specialty is making fine-scale maps of pre-European fire regimes and historical vegetation. To date, he's mapped some 2.9 million acres in 22 natural areas across 7 different states. And most notably, in 2015, Cecil received the Stoddard Award for Lifetime Achievement in Fire Ecology from the Association for Fire Ecology. Well, welcome, Cecil. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to your presentation. Welcome everyone who's logged in. And one moment as we pull up your slides, sir, for you to go.
Okay. Thanks, and thanks everyone. I have put on the opening slide my contact information in the lower left-hand corner, and it'll also be on the closing slide. And as mentioned, this talk will be posted, and you will also be able to download it as a PDF. But feel free to use the phone numbers or email there and contact me if you have questions later that don't get covered during the talk, or just want to talk about the issues that we're going to cover, which are the things that we should be doing with fire now. And some of them are things that we've not been doing. How do I advance this slide here? That's where, yeah. What will this do for?
Should be the left and right arrows at the bottom of the screen there.
Yeah,
there you go.
It didn't seem to be working at first. Okay, objectives for today are to try and look at what's happening now in the way things are in fire ecology and the support we get for that. And we all know how the way things are. We want to look at where we're going and get on the same page. And I want to talk about a couple of issues, which the most important of which is restoring fire integrity. And this is a term that I and a couple of biologists are working on a paper for conservation biology about. It's the concept of getting fire back into the landscape so that the landscape looks and functions the way it did under the natural fire regime. I'm also going to talk about the issue of using focused fire, and we'll get to that in a bit. Those are 2 real take-home things from this talk. This is a quotation from Ed Komarick, who published some pioneer work on the role of lightning in establishing natural fire regimes. His work, his major papers were 1961 through 1966, and at a meeting in the early 1980s, he was pronounced the father of fire ecology at one of the Tall Timbers conferences. And I think it's a term truly deserved, and we'll explore some of the implications of what he found as we go along. There's some amazing work being done, especially over the last 20 years. It's been increasing in volume by paleontologists and palynologists around paleo wildfire. And this is starting to expand into a study of the evolution of fuel and the evolution of fire regimes and the evolution of fire relations of all of the terrestrial species of plants, animals, birds on the earth. Fascinating business. The studies in palynology are mostly focused around fusinite, which is the term for fossil charcoal. There was fire on the earth even before there was terrestrial vegetation. And one way that that could happen is accumulation of rack of marine algae along shorelines that dried out and could be ignited by lightning. And there are fossil fulgurites, which are little casts made by lightning fusing sand. We know lightning was abundant at the time. By the mid-Silurian, 431 years ago, the first tracheids appear in terrestrial vegetation. And that is the beginning of fire ecology in a way, because these are the basic components of wood, the components of xylem. They're the little tubes that transport water and have material that can help hold up a grass stem or a redwood, and it also provides the basis of fuel because these are very flammable units. By only a few million years later, 418 million years ago in the early Devonian, the first true leaves appeared, and diversification of terrestrial plant species radiated rapidly after that date, so that by the end of the Devonian, we had fully developed terrestrial flora ranging from low ground vegetation to very large lycopods resembling redwoods. And we have already abundant evidence of early fire regimes, including frequent fire regimes and long interval fire regimes in peatlands, very similar to what we have with Atlantic white cedar on peats of the Atlantic coastlines, where you have long interval fires with catastrophic results. So evidence is accumulating through the whole geologic period, and there's amazing things that are being turned out. First bark formed in the lower Carbonaceous. The first grasses evolved in the early Cretaceous, 129 million years ago, laying the basis for the familiar layers of light flashy fuels that we have now. And finally, only in the last 500,000 years, we arrived, the smart monkeys. Our mission, as seen by the conservation community, I've surveyed the literature following it in recent years, the talk in conservation biology, the journal, and also at meetings that dealt with climate change and things like that. And there's a wide view of opinions about the crisis that is coming on the survival of biodiversity. There's sort of most of the discussions around two issues, and that is, well, first let me say that restoration of natural communities, restoration of fire regimes, in some ways has been abandoned. You get people that will say things like restoration is passé. You have an inclination in the conservation biology community to work to protect focal species. These are people that work with animals. And there has been the argument proposed in 1978 by Lambeck that if you take a particular focal species like sage grouse that you are really interested in conserving, do everything you can for that species, everything else will fall into place. There's been very little evidence in the 30 or 40 years since then that that's true. You can look at it as sort of faith-based ecology if you want. Because the problem with that approach is it's a top-down approach. You take a top species like tigers or elk that you want to conserve, and everything else is supposed to be trickle-down benefits. In reality, to preserve as much of our biotic diversity as we can for the future, we need a bottom-up approach, and fire is the principal tool for a bottom-up approach. One part of the discussion is that we can expect dichotomization of all lands into either multifunctional landscapes, and this includes what the Nature Conservancy calls working landscapes, such as western ranches, where people are living and making a living on the land while trying to preserve a modicum of natural values at the same time. And then there is another category for the lands that are wholly converted to production. And this, you know, cities, towns, factories, and this includes intensive agriculture. And there's the term that's popular in the agricultural community about sustainable intensification. And what they're talking about is intensification of production of soybeans and corn and crop species like that. The sustainable does not refer to biodiversity. It refers to the sustainability of soybeans. So I think we need a much broader view than this dichotomization. And I'm proposing, and some other people I'm working with, that we are really looking at a great triage, and it's actually a gradient. But we want to look at these three domains. The number one, natural areas that are reserved for full restoration from the bottom up with fire. This is being done in few places now. It's going to happen unless we are committed or complacent about losing at least 50% of the species of plants, birds, animals, and even microbes on the earth. Nothing short of full restoration, bottom up, is going to work to provide the habitats that all these species need. Domain number two are multifunctional landscapes, as we just talked about. Number three are those lands completely devoted to production. So this is domain two. This is the Nature Conservancy's Matador Ranch in north central Montana. It's just about 60,000 acres, and they have agreements with neighboring ranchers covering 266,000 additional acres. And part of the debate for signing agreements where they try and do some work for conservation of native species like sage grouse are that the ranchers can have allotments for grazing cattle on the conservancy lands. This is certainly something, an approach that is being spread around the world. The Conservancy is leading that effort, and it's going to be a key to survival in the future. But it won't work for preservation of biodiversity. This is a cattle landscape. This is on the edge of the, on the left is the Lost Trail National Wildlife Refuge, a fairly new refuge. And along the fence line, fence lines are fun to look at throughout the country, especially in the West. This whole landscape was grazed by cattle at this point for 100 years. It was also excluded from fire for 100 years. And currently the area on the right is grazed by cattle. The timber company that owns that land leases out the rights. This area cattle have been excluded for 12 years, so you can see a dramatic difference in the understory. The legacy of that 100 years without fire and 100 years with cattle is how many forbs can you see? Forbs are infinitely palatable to cattle and preferable, the ones that are tasty, over grasses on any day. If you have flowering aster family or certain other groups, you'll see cattle heading directly for those before they bother with the grass. Another cattle issue, this is a study done with one of my partners on the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge with saltbush. It's one of those very tasty plants. You can nibble on the leaves, they're salty, and make a nice little snack. This is a saltbush plant on the left, a very healthy saltbush in a protected area of that particular refuge. The blue bars that you see are all areas with cattle excluded. The top bar, cattle has been excluded for over 30 years, and that's actually a federal wilderness area within the refuge. The bottom three bars have cattle. The two red bars are prairie lands managed with cattle at what are considered best management practices. And you can see saltbush is basically extirpated and eventually will be gone. They nibble it down to the ground and it eventually dies. The orange bar is an experimental area where cattle are only grazed for half the summer and very low stocking. And this might approach the impact of bison. We're going to have to face up to the fact that we're going to have to have many lands that are reserved from cattle grazing, and that's not going to go over very well, especially in the western U.S. But it's a reality if we want to preserve species diversity. Here's an example of Domain 1. This is not far from the Matador Ranch, but cattle have been excluded for a number of years. And we want to start forming images in our mind here, there, and everywhere across the country, especially for areas that you personally are associated with either managing or doing research in. What did the natural landscape under full fire integrity look like? And this is an example. In this case, you see the char on the bases of these Ponderosa pines. You see the species-rich understory. And this fire regime has been maintained strictly by lightning ignitions. It's in a lightning hotspot, and no prescribed burning has been done here, but it so happens that it's been burned just by lightning at the historical documented frequency of lightning here, which is in the range of about 5 to 12 years. You can see the species diversity in the understory. So this is an image to remember this kind of landscape under a natural fire regime. This is a painting by Philip Juris, who is the principal artist displaying visions of what the pre-European landscape looked like. This is a painting of the Black Belt Prairies in northern Alabama. And this same communities that were structured like this with large treeless prairies extended north on up through central Tennessee and as far east as the Columbian Plateau, on up through central Kentucky, and then you jump up to Ohio with the eastern extension of the Prairie Peninsula up there. This was a sort of a mid-grass prairie, very species rich. So I want to look at the species that were maintained by these fire regimes in some of these communities. Incidentally, that last community and Philip Juris's paintings all are things you can put in your brain as what the original landscape looked like. These are visions that the public has no concept of at present. This is a very fire-dependent species, Venus flytrap. It's an ancient species. If you look at the close-up of the plant, this is a single leaf. This is the petiole, and it's tipped by this amazing structure, the trap. It has these little teeth along the edge. It has a triggering mechanism that can operate fast enough to catch a fly, and it forms a little cage when closed. And then it has a digestive mechanism. It forms a little stomach and secretes enzymes to get the nitrogen and other nutrients it needs from the insects. These occur in very nitrogen-poor environments. Then, if you look closely, you just may be able to make out 3 bulbous-tipped little trichomes down here on the leaf. They're reddish. And this is the mechanism that triggers the trap, and an insect has to work an algorithm to trigger it. If a fly touches one of these triggers, nothing happens. If it waits a while and touches another, nothing happens. But if it touches 2 of the 3 trigger hairs, within a short time, the trap snaps shut. Nobody has any idea how that works, but it's an example of extreme coevolution of plants with fire regimes. And this goes back millions of years. I've not heard anybody who's attempted to calculate the antiquity of this plant. And this occurs only in very frequent fire habitats, which implies long duration through time of those fire frequencies. The little chart on the right is a study I did when I was with the Plant Conservation Program in the Green Swamp of North Carolina. Each dot here represents the mean of from 5 to 25 little square meter plots that we put in. This green swamp area, this was called shoestring savanna, had been burned annually by the timber company that owned it for 20 years before it was acquired by the Nature Conservancy. After acquisition, fire frequency dropped a little, and we were able to do this study. And what we found, amazingly, was the greatest number of Venus flytraps, 12 per square meter on average, occurred under annual fire regimes. Then, as fire frequency dropped to 2, 3, and 4 years and beyond, the populations just plunged. So that if you reached a mean fire return interval of 4 years, the species was gone. This is documentation of Venus flytrap as the most fire-dependent species known. And in the intervening years, I've been searching for more analogs of this and finding them in various places across the country. This is a comparison from Reed Nossas' book, Forgotten Grasslands of the South, and a comparison he did looking at the Great Plains. Incidentally, I told Reed I would mention his new book on fire ecology of the South that will be coming out sometime about a year from now. So that is something to be eagerly looked forward to. This is the Great Plains biome. 15 states and provinces, beginning with central Saskatchewan all the way down to north central Texas. A huge biome. We're going to compare that with similar grasslands in the southeast. Reed did this, and with Alan Weekly's help at the Botanical Garden in North Carolina at the university, we added a few more genera and a few more states. So if you look at this, the huge Great Plains biome has 2 big bluestem species. There are 19 of those in Florida. Indian grass is 1 in the Great Plains, 4 in the southeast, and so on. Little bluestems 1 in the Great Plains, 10 in the southeast. And this is an amazing phenomenon. This is partly due to the antiquity of that landscape. The southern Appalachians, as Alan Weekly pointed out at a talk at the Atlanta Botanical Garden last fall, have been around, standing there in the landscape since there was terrestrial vegetation. That is just astounding. That and the fire frequency make the southeastern U.S. probably the premier place in the world to study evolution of fire ecologies, evolution of fuel, and evolution of relationships of organisms with that fire regime. The other factor, besides that antiquity and diversity of habitats, is the fire frequency. And this is also from Reed's last book. This is a compilation of NOAA ground flash data from across the country, with the warmer colors being higher lightning strike density. So you see that Florida experienced and still experiences a lightning strike density of 8 to 16 strikes per square kilometer per year. And that is a real bombardment. There are even higher areas within that in places. This whole regime is driven by the Gulf of Mexico. This is a body of warm, steamy water out here, and when you have a high pressure center rotating like this, it serves as a pump to carry all that moisture up through central Texas, up through the central plains here, where it meets colder air and finally washes out to sea when it's lost most of its moisture. And this is a fire pump, basically, and it's been operating for some 45 million years. That's the age of the Gulf of Mexico. That also accounts for the antiquity of fire relations of species in this area. We'll look at a few. This is Harper's Beauty. Joan Walker, a fire ecologist, did her dissertation research in the green swamp. There are hundreds of fire-dependent species there. This is one on the panhandle of Florida, and this little species is very similar. It's an analog to Venus flytrap, grows in moist wetland transition areas, is easily overgrown, needs nearly annual fire to just survive. And it was down to only 2 counties in Florida, highlighted in yellow there. When Joan was studying them about 20 years ago, all of the remaining plants of the species were on moist soils on the margins of I-10, not its original habitat. Joan restored some areas in the Appalachian National Forest with clearing, introducing frequent fire, and reintroducing the species, and they're doing fine there. This is a species like Venus flytrap that are key indicators, some of the best indicators for the integrity of the natural fire regime. This is another species, doesn't require fire quite that often. It's more on the order of 3 to 5 years. And this little aster, Georgia aster, we did a study of when I was with the plant conservation program, and we found 52 sites in its entire range from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Of those 52 sites, 48 were on power lines and roadsides. And this is the plight of the ground flora in the eastern United States. Only 4 species were in semi-natural looking habitats, and they were habitats that duplicated oaks. Trying to get my controls back here where they actually work. There we go. We were talking about golden paintbrush. Where did we leave off? About here. So this idea of getting this image in our minds of what the natural landscape was like. This is a fantastic map produced by Rich Guyette at the University of Missouri Tree Ring Lab a few years ago, 2012. And he did this entirely by a large equation looking at physical properties of climate and other things that I do not understand, and produced this map showing original fire frequency of the U.S. based on climate, topography, and things like that. And I have vetted this map in a number of places that I have done pre-settlement fire frequency maps for, and found that even though it's a broad brush method, it's very accurate for most of the places I've looked at. So this is something you can print. This will be on the talk if you download a copy and hang this on your wall just as a background. The take-home point from this map is all of the yellow colors, starting with this one right here, coming all through the oranges and reds, are areas that have a historical fire frequency ranging from about 1 to 14 years. What this tells you is that the pre-settlement landscape of the United States was a fire landscape, and not only that, it was a frequent fire landscape. You can get more detailed information from land fire, the layer that we produced in 2004, and you do that by going to this data site here, the land fire data distribution tool, and you click on a point, and that will bring up a map that looks something like this. And then you can use little tools up in the corner to draw a box around an area that you're specifically interested in. At that point, though, you need to have ArcGIS or find somebody that does have it. And any natural areas that you work with or are interested in or are responsible for, you really should have that map hanging on your wall somewhere. Get someone to print them for you if necessary, because that's a good part of the background. This is Rich's map of Texas, this extreme high fire frequency area in east central Texas. This is the land fire map, which agrees with that largely, but there is more detail in fire frequency, and you can expand this using ArcGIS. You have to take land fire with a grain of salt because it does a fantastic job of covering the entire United States. Land fire does not look at fire movement, and that's critical for fire frequency in the landscape, and you need to know how to do that. I'm working on a book chapter paragraph right now describing how you can do it yourself. But a simple version, if you have that land fire map and a topo map, and you know the wind direction prevailing from the southwest in most of the United States, you can think of sprinkling random ignitions over a landscape, and they're going to all mostly move in this direction with the prevailing winds. The red lines are fire pathways, and these are uplands that are unbroken by streams, so that a fire originating here can cover all of that distance and spread throughout this landscape. And this is something you can do visually, even without getting into it at this level. I chopped the fire frequency gradient into about 7 fire frequency classes. Usually the white area has 1 to 3 years, and then increasingly longer intervals as you go downwind until you reach a barrier, a fire break right here. And then you have a darker area called a fire shadow, and you can teach yourself to look for these in the landscape. This is the map I did for Mammoth Cave National Park. Historically, this had a 300 square mile fire compartment down here that was eastern midgrass and tallgrass prairie. And fires moving across this at that interval would come to a stop when they reached the Green River. And this is an excellent fire break. It's a deeply entrenched meander into limestone. So fires have a very hard, few fires would actually cross that. Consequently, on the downwind side, these darker colors indicate a fire shadow, where there's little or even no fire in some places. And that was easily documented by the several hundred early historical survey plats I collected and looked at the trees. Up here you have treeless grassland. You have oak savanna in a transition area. And then down here, immediately across the river, you're in beech and sugar maple, both very fire refugial trees. And sugar maple was so abundant that in 1830, the settlers produced 12,000 pounds of maple sugar from the trees, from the sap collected in this valley. Once you're on the other side of the fire shadow, ignitions over here start to pick up and move with the prevailing winds and coalesce, and they lead here to another 30, several hundred square mile frequent fire prairie compartment going all the way up from this park up to Elizabethtown, Kentucky. So,
Cecil, this is David. When you have those maps up, please use the arrow tool so that we can see your cursor to point out different parts of the illustrations. Oh, okay. Where do I get the arrow tool? That's at the top of your presentation window. There's an arrow pointing towards the, looks like towards the southeast. Click on that and drag it around the screen. And then click and drag, and we should be able to see your pointer that way. Okay, thank you. We had some questions that came in from the audience about that. Thanks. So in this landscape, this is the green swamp of North Carolina, very species rich, and in fact, the highest species richness, some of the highest species richness in the world occurs in the green swamp, with up to 100 species in a square meter, the highest that you can find outside of rainforests. But the point here is this is another place where you can get a visual image of what the natural landscape looked like. Today, my guess from working with rare species and looking at them in North Carolina, about 62% of our federal endangered and threatened plant species are rare because they're dependent on frequent fire. We live in an overgrown world in the eastern U.S., and we have something up as high as 2,000 species that are now found principally on roadsides. And these are not stable habitats. Things that are dependent on roadsides are headed for extinction because this will be widened eventually. Someone will come along with a grader and just blade this all off. So back to our objectives. I'm going to talk now about focused fire, and this is a new concept in a way. It's the antithesis of a fire rotation. And I want to clarify this because people are misusing this with potentially disastrous consequences around the country. This is a forestry term that was developed by Bud Heinzelman in the Boundary Waters area some 50 years ago. And the idea was to get a handle on a landscape where there were patchy fires with trees in varying intensities, and to get an idea of how much fire there was in the landscape. So he mapped areas that had burned, and so here's a red area right here. This particular 1,000 acres burned 4 times during as he was collecting data. This one 3 times. Blue, these other colors indicate 2 and 1, and the white are areas that burned not at all. And so a fire rotation, by definition,
is when the sum of these areas that burned reached the area of the natural area. 100,000 acres in this case. So when he added these up, this is 4,000 here and 4,000 here. When he got to 100,000 acres, that was considered a fire rotation, even though much of the area didn't burn at all. This is some of the problems with that. This is a theoretical area, Smoky Bear National Forest, and over here we've burned a quarter of it, these 1,000-acre blocks, 4 times. So that gives us this 25,000 acres. That gives us 100,000 acres. So we've completed 1 fire rotation, even though nothing else burned. This particular patch we could burn 100 times, and that is a fire rotation by definition. We need to forget about this term. I would like people not to use even the words fire rotation anymore. This is the problem in the Southeast. There are people that use this on public lands, and so here's a 500,000 acre forest, and people set out to burn it all. So you burn 5,000 acres here, 5,000 next year, 5,000, and so on until you get back to the beginning. You've burned the whole 500,000 acres in 100 years. And what you've done is set up a 100-year fire interval, and you've lost 75% of your species diversity. This is an ecological disaster that we need to stop doing. So what do you do in a real landscape? This is Mammoth Cave again. You look at the areas with the highest fire frequency. That's where all of the rare species, the most diversity of species and communities are going to be. And in Mammoth Cave, there are these light areas here. This is the park boundary here. So you're looking at this area, this one, and this one. Okay, right, sorry. So if we sum all of those areas on a GIS system, we find that those light areas we just looked at total 1,226 acres. And those originally had something like a 2 or 3 year fire interval. So if you want to simulate that, these are the areas you should home in on, because these are where the rare species are. And if you did that, if you divided this by 3, it means you would burn 400 acres a year. And if you had limited resources and you could only burn 1,000 acres or so, these are the ones you should do first, and make sure that you cover all of those areas within a 3-year period. Then if you have more resources, you go to the next category. Most of your species diversity are going to be in these 2 blocks, and you must let the rest go, even if you have other projects you would like to do, because otherwise you're going to be losing diversity and losing communities from there. If you get other resources, you can move on to restoring oak woodland structure and things like that. This is a really important concept. Some changes that have happened in the last 50 years. About World War II, the whole world would look like this for structure, for organizations. The big boss, like a general during a war, this is the general's officers, and the soldiers are down here. It became apparent that organizations accomplish their purposes much more efficiently in business and science if you inverted the pyramid. And the idea is these people, the employees here, are the ones on the front lines that really know the landscape. They're doing the work with fire, etc., and wildlife. And the job of top management and middle management is to give these people the power and the materials they need. In reality, life works out like this. Some decisions have to be made in Washington. But this is producing amazing results around the country. I'm going to give a couple of examples of what we should be working toward with fire and one way to accomplish it. And one thing that is really true that I see from what people are doing around the country is that for this foreseeable future, given what we have, any progress in restoring fire integrity is going to be made from the bottom up, which means we are the leaders. No matter if we're on the bottom of the rung, there are chances for doing that. This is facilitated by these interagency agreements we have everywhere, like the Southern Fire Exchange. And at the local level, memoranda of understanding and agreements between federal agencies and between all of the state agencies so that you can form whole networks. The legal structure and permissions are all there to do that. We looked at a couple of examples. Excuse me. This is Lost Trail National Wildlife Refuge in northern Montana. It's in the northern Rockies. This is a virgin larch savanna that had originally, from fire scar work we've done, a 1 to 6 year fire interval. You don't think of this sort of thing in the northern Rockies, but this is a grassland in an alpine valley. It was a lightning ignition hotspot, still is, where we had 3 ignitions last year, and they were all put out quickly by helicopters with buckets, and 3 ignitions the previous year. We've recently done a prescribed burn in this area here, and this is larch, possibly a more fire-adapted tree than longleaf pine. It can build bark at its base 9 inches thick, and that is to resist the light fires. That is its natural habitat. It doesn't put so much effort above that. It's a beautiful area. This is a huge bed of camas that bloomed last spring, and camas was an important food for Native Americans. It has a bulb on the bottom. This is an area from which cattle have been excluded. Cattle and elk both love it. It was a major food for Native Americans, and this is a historic photo of a woman they gathered huge piles of camas bulbs, dried them in camas ovens, and stored them away for the winter. On the nearby Salish and Kootenai reservation, the Flathead Reservation, they're restoring fire and trying to restore fire integrity to the entire reservation. These same Indians, the Kootenai, migrated through that valley we were just looking at where you saw the camas and probably contributed on their annual migrations and camas digging to the fire regime there. This is an area that had been fire suppressed for a long time, and you can see the blue camas coming up in the area that was burned. These fire crews are working to accomplish this goal. The young people on the reservations, as soon as they're old enough, get summer jobs to make money on fire crews. And so they're the best crews in the country. They're experienced for decades in doing fire. They know prescribed fire. This is a Salish Kootenai Confederated fire crew on Salish Kootenai lands doing part of their restoration. And they're totally skilled with fires. You can see they're fully equipped. They know what they're doing. They're also fully equipped with knowledge. They haven't learned it just recently. And another factor is they're fully determined. They have the will to do this. And I talked to the head of their fire crew, and I said, why are you doing this? We're doing this restoration. And he said, it is the will of the elders. And I think my mouth hung open for several seconds, because in my mind I was thinking, where the hell are our elders? Where can we get some? But it's amazing the enthusiasm that is building for this. I went to the Natural Areas Conference in Davis, California last fall, and a woman who was involved in fire restoration in a coastal tribal area was showing slides of the work they had done, pictures like this, showing areas that had been opened up, things were blooming, and she started crying in the middle of the presentation. And she was just so moved by, she was involved in restoring the beautiful landscapes that her grandmother had described to her when she was a girl, and restoring all of the marsh species that they use for gathering for making baskets and other tools. So we need this kind of commitment for the rest of us. I'm going to show 2 examples of what one person can do. This is Beverly Skinner here. I couldn't get her to send me a picture. She's shy. But she is the main person in charge of this refuge. They've been reduced to 2 personnel, and the refuge manager moved to town, and he's an enforcement person and comes back mostly to do some paperwork. Beverly realized that this valley had been terribly impacted by the railroad had been put through, used for a road. They brought in huge ditching machinery, put ditching along the railroad, drained all of the wetlands that supported huge numbers of waterfowl into these ditches, and she realized that was the #1 job that had to get done. Being only only person living on the refuge now. Incidentally, this is a big slab of one of those virgin larch that we were doing some dendrochronology with. But Beverly, this little woman, got together, just got on the phone, got a bunch of people from about a dozen state, federal, and local agencies to get together to see if they could get excited about restoring this alpine wetland. And they did. And they went back and they gathered $7 million and set up a 2-year program to get the road out of the valley. Moving a couple of miles of public road is a big project. But they got the funding and they are doing it, all at the will of this one person. And here's a case of you had to first build a road, the new road on the uplands, out of the wetlands. And then you moved toward restoring the wetlands. This is the old railroad bed, the public road, and that's the project for this year, is to restore the wetlands. So these deep ditches have already been filled on both sides. They're leveling it down to the level of the valley floor, the wetlands there, and getting the water table back up. An amazing accomplishment by one person on the bottom of the old pyramid. A second example, this is the El Dorado National Forest in California. And this nick right here is where Nevada sticks into California. The Sierra Nevada runs, keep forgetting the green arrow, runs along this border right here in that direction. And this fire was started last year right about at this point. Fire crews were brought in, and here's the city. If you've been on any fire cruise yourself, you know what this is like. This is an instant city with vehicles and shelters and food and tents and the whole thing. This was a huge fire. It started an ignition down here at the southern end. This is a ridge running this way, right aligned with the prevailing winds. And this ignition, after a day or two, moved onto the uplands and took off and ran. It covered 15 miles in 3 days, during which time it was unstoppable. This is the view from Lake Tahoe in the foreground, and you can see just this massive pyrocumulus up here. And there's nothing you can do when that happens. And this is totally unnatural. These communities were Ponderosa and Jeffrey pine savannas historically. Nothing like the fuel here. We have over 100 years of woody fuel buildup that caused this. Skip those two for time. This is what the virgin forest that still remains there. That fire burned up, even though it was 95,000 acres, involved 8,000 people to fight the fire, totally devastated the lands that were consumed. But there is still, that was only about a fifth of the land, and they still have a great deal of virgin forest left. And it looks like this. You can see on one of the old virgin trees there, here's another 5 or 6 foot tree, and these are at about 7,000 feet, about 50-50 Ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine. So the district ranger is taking on actually restoring this landscape. People have said it can't be done, but we're realizing now there's growing support for doing it to prevent total loss of all of this. He has a system that he's come up with. Step 1 is burn out the ridge tops. So there are some old logging roads that serve as access along there. The idea is to keep fire from getting up over the top and into the next watershed. Second is burn out jackpot fuels like this area that has 100 tons per acre. To get rid of those spots, do them in small patches at a time. The next step is to burn the rest under moist conditions and do it slowly over many years because you have a huge litter and duff buildup. There is not a sprig of grass or forb left in these situations with over 100 years of fire exclusion. Then it has to be done repeatedly and gently many times to remove that layer so that you don't kill the remnant virgin trees. On situations like this, you also have to do other work, and his step 4 is drop everything up to 20 inches, just chainsaw it. Step 5 is selectively girdle stems above 20 inches, leaving just enough trees to approximate the original stand age structure. And then finally, do continuing light prescribed burns under moist conditions until you've slowly gotten rid of that duff layer and let the old trees get their roots back down into the soil. An ambitious project that will take a lot of people. It will take something like this command structure that you have for fighting wildfires. And Dwayne Nelson has proposed for the first time to use this command structure. This is a type 1 wildfire that Forest Service uses this nationally. This is a big wildfire like the El Dorado. It means you're going to be on television. You may be on CNN and Fox News. The type 2 is more state level, and the oversight here is Washington, D.C. and the state forester. Down here you're down to the state forester and the regional forester. And there's type 3 wildfires that are ones that can be handled by the district ranger in the forest district. Wayne has proposed setting up a standing type 3 incident command team for restoration and prescribed fire. And that would be the way to use the existing structure and existing funding for wildfires. Set this up as a demonstration project to use it for restoration. And this is something that could possibly take off and be an answer for what seemed impossible in the future. So to reiterate, in the future, any progress we're going to make in restoring fire integrity is going to be from the bottom up, not top down.
All right. Today's webinar was recorded, and we hope you'll enjoy that at a later date on our YouTube page. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks so much, Cecil, and everyone in NC State who made this happen today.